I inherited £28 million. Before I could even process the shock, the bank manager looked at his screen and said, "Madam, according to our records, you've been divorced for 8 months." I sat completely still for 4 seconds. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I did the one thing a forensic accountant does best. I followed the paper trail to destroy him. I sat opposite Mr. Sterling, a senior wealth manager in the City of London who looked just as uncomfortable as I did. He slid a printed document across his mahogany desk. It was a decree absolute, stamped and finalized by the County Family Court 8 months ago. My name was on it. Julian's name was on it. The signature at the bottom, supposedly mine, was a masterful forgery. I stared at the black ink. For 8 months, I had been waking up next to a man who was legally no longer my husband. We attended my mother's high-end parish church every Sunday, maintaining the flawless image of black British excellence that my family worshipped. Julian would smile at me, kiss my cheek, and sleep in the Victorian semi-detached house whose mortgage I paid, knowing I was nothing more than a housemate he had legally discarded. My mind went straight to logistics. Why would Julian divorce me in secret? He was a sales director with expensive tastes, always trying to keep up with my sister Sophie's white husband, Rupert. Rupert loved to boast about his property portfolio, and Julian hated feeling inadequate. If Julian filed for a secret divorce, he thought he was about to strike it rich. He cut our legal ties to ensure I couldn't touch his sudden windfall. A slow, humorless smile spread across my face. Julian had severed the legal cord to protect his imaginary wealth, but in doing so, he completely isolated himself from mine. Mr. Sterling shifted in his leather chair, misinterpreting my silence for shock. "I am so sorry, Eleanor," he said softly. "We were processing the transfer of your Aunt Beatrix's estate, and the system flagged your marital status during the compliance check. Since you are legally single, we cannot transfer the funds into your joint trust, Aunt Beatrix. She was the outcast of the family, the eccentric aunt my mother, Margaret, actively avoided. My mother only cared about her Surrey Country Club memberships and keeping up appearances. She considered Beatrix too weird, too dark-skinned, and far too embarrassing for her refined Sunday garden parties. But I always loved her. While my family criticized me for being a boring accountant, Beatrix saw my analytical mind as a gift. What they didn't know was that she was a brilliant software engineer. She passed away quietly last month, leaving her £28 million fortune to the only relative who ever bothered to visit her. Me. If Julian and I were still married, he would have drained my inheritance to fund his lifestyle and compete with Rupert. But because he forged that decree absolute behind my back, the £28 million belonged solely, legally, and entirely to me. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady, "do not apologize. This is the best news I've had all day. I need you to do exactly as I say. We are not using the joint trust. I want you to set up an opaque private limited company immediately. Transfer the £28 million into that account. Ensure my name is shielded from the public register at Company's House." Mr. Sterling nodded. "Consider it done. And what about your existing accounts?" "Freeze them," I ordered. "Every secondary credit card attached to my name that Julian currently holds. Close them. Block the transfers. Cut the financial arteries. If he wants to be a single man, he can start paying for his own things." With every click of his mouse, I was dismantling the safety net my ex-husband had been resting on. For years, I had been the reliable, invisible packhorse of the family. I paid the bills, balanced the budgets, and absorbed the condescension from my mother, my sister Sophie, and her arrogant husband. They mistook my silence for weakness. They were about to learn that a quiet auditor is the most dangerous person in the room. After signing the documents to secure my new empire, I walked out of the bank. The afternoon London sun hit my face. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. I was 34. I was newly rich and legally free of a parasite who thought he had outsmarted me. My phone buzzed in my handbag. I pulled it out to see a text from Julian. "Hi, beautiful. Pick up some Wagyu steaks on the way home. Sophie and Rupert are coming round for dinner tonight. I'm using your platinum card to get some expensive Chablis to impress Rupert. Love you." I stared at the words, marveling at the sheer audacity of the man. He was inviting the very family members who constantly belittled me into my home, expecting me to feed them all while he spent my money like a legally single man. 3 seconds later, a second notification popped up on my screen. It was an automated alert from the bank. Transaction declined. £7,500 at Boodles on Bond Street. I stopped walking. Julian wasn't buying wine. He was buying diamonds. Considering my ring size was nowhere near a £7,500 budget, I knew exactly what this meant. He had another woman. He had secretly divorced me, secured his new target, and was using my credit to buy her engagement ring. The stakes, the dinner, the fake affection, it was all a delaying tactic. I slowly slipped the phone back into my bag. A cold sensation of absolute purpose settled deep into my bones. He wanted a lavish dinner with my toxic family. I would give him exactly that. But tonight, instead of Wagyu steaks, I'd be serving an entirely different main course, one he and my truly dreadful family would never forget. I walked through the front door of my own home, the house I had painstakingly paid off over the last 5 years, carrying nothing but my handbag. The rich scent of garlic and rosemary drifted from the kitchen, a stark contrast to the cold reality I now carried with me. Julian was standing by the marble island, pouring a generous glass of Bordeaux. He wore his favorite cashmere jumper, playing the role of the devoted, hard-working husband to absolute perfection. He turned, flashing that signature smile that used to make my heart skip a beat. Now, he just looked like a poorly constructed spreadsheet. "Where are the steaks, darling?" he asked, his eyes scanning my empty hands. "I've got a whole marinade ready to go." I dropped my keys on the worktop, keeping my posture completely relaxed. "I've decided we're having salads tonight. I'm doing a detox." Julian frowned. The polished facade cracked for a fraction of a second. "Salads? Eleanor, you know Rupert expects a proper meal. Speaking of which, did you get an alert from the bank? I tried to pick up a couple of bottles of that imported Pinot Noir Rupert likes, but your card was declined." The cashier muttered something about a security hold. "You really need to ring your bank. These glitches are embarrassing." I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. "I will definitely look into those glitches," I said smoothly. Before Julian could press the issue, the doorbell rang. He hurried to answer, wrapping my younger sister Sophie in an exaggerated hug. Sophie strutted into my hallway, holding her phone up, already streaming to her 50,000 followers about her fabulous Sunday family dinner. Her husband, Rupert, followed closely behind, ducking his head to avoid the chandelier he always complained hung too low. Rupert wore a bespoke linen suit that screamed old money, though I knew for a fact his credit score barely scraped 600. "Eleanor," Rupert boomed, bypassing a hug to offer a stiff, corporate nod. "How's the glorified bookkeeping business treating you? Still staring at spreadsheets in a cubicle while the real players are out there building wealth?" I took a slow sip of my water. "I do forensic accounting, Rupert. I catch people who pretend to have money when they are actually drowning in debt." Rupert let out a loud, forced laugh, slapping Julian on the shoulder. "Well, you need to learn from your husband. Julian has that real hustle. We were just talking about expanding our portfolios. You know how it is. Black British excellence meets traditional capital. We're unstoppable." The sheer audacity of this white man, weaponizing the slang of my culture to disguise his financial incompetence, turned my stomach. Sophie finally lowered her phone, tossing her designer handbag onto my pristine white sofa. She looked me up and down, her lip curled slightly at my work suit, elegant but understated. "Eleanor, you really need me to give you a style consultation," Sophie sighed, examining her flawless manicure. "You dress like you're going to a funeral. Anyway, Rupert and I have incredible news. Rupert is breaking ground on a massive new luxury development in Canary Wharf. It's going to completely change the city skyline. We wanted to give the family the first opportunity to invest." Julian leaned against the worktop, playing the role of the supportive brother-in-law. "It's a golden opportunity, Eleanor. Rupert has the vision. He just needs a bit of liquid capital to secure the planning permissions. I was actually thinking we could leverage the equity in this house to get them the seed money. Keeps it in the family, and the return on investment will be massive." I looked at the three of them. My sister who resented my stability, her husband who disguised his racism as aggressive corporate jargon, and the man who had legally divorced me 8 months ago, casually suggesting we remortgage my property to fund a scam. I picked up my fork and calmly stabbed a cherry tomato from the bowl I'd set on the island. "Rupert," I said, chewing slowly, "walk me through the synergy of this new development. What's your projected debt-to-equity ratio for the first fiscal quarter?" Rupert puffed out his chest, slipping into his salesman persona. "It's all about regeneration zones, Eleanor. We're looking at a hybrid model. We provide the seed capital, secure the zoning rights, and flip the commercial interest to a larger developer. The margins are astronomical." I put my fork down, letting the silence stretch until Rupert shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "That is a fascinating string of buzzwords," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "Even regeneration zones require a 50% property improvement metric within 30 months to qualify for the capital gains tax exemption. Given that your primary holding company currently has 3 county court judgments for unpaid contractors' invoices, no high street bank is going to approve your planning permissions. You don't have a hybrid model. You have a Ponzi scheme wrapped in a linen suit. The kitchen fell dead silent. Sophie stared at me, her mouth open, her face flushing with rage. Rupert's jaw tightened. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face. Julian stepped in quickly, trying to defuse the bomb I'd just dropped. "Eleanor, there's no need to be aggressive," Julian said, his voice edged with a warning. "Rupert is family. We support each other in this house." I looked straight into Julian's eyes. "Oh, I am all for supporting family, Julian. I just like to make sure the accounts balance before I sign any checks." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it. Rupert cleared his throat, suddenly finding the marble worktops fascinating. Julian grabbed the bottle of Bordeaux and 2 glasses. "Rupert, let's step out onto the patio. Give the sisters a minute to catch up. I need some fresh air anyway." Rupert nodded quickly, and the 2 men practically fled through the glass sliding doors into the cool evening air. Sophie immediately grabbed her phone, furiously texting someone, probably complaining about my toxic energy. I ignored her and walked over to the kitchen island where Julian had abandoned his synced iPad. As a forensic auditor, my home network was my domain. I had router logs that tracked every device. I tapped the screen of Julian's tablet, bypassing his simple passcode. I didn't have to look hard. Right on his home screen was a recently modified folder named Project Horizon. I opened it. The first document was a set of architectural plans for a sprawling multi-million-pound mansion. In the bottom right corner of the blueprint sat the unmistakable logo of Rupert's failing property firm. Rupert wasn't building a commercial development in Canary Wharf. He was building a bespoke mansion for Julian. I swiped to the next document in the folder. It was a catering invoice and a guest list from a luxury event planner. The header of the document was written in elegant calligraphy. It read, "You are cordially invited to the engagement celebration of Julian and Arabella." I stared at the name Arabella. The woman who had just received a £7,500 diamond ring paid for by my declined credit card. Julian and Rupert weren't just plotting to steal the equity in my home. They were actively building Julian's new life with his new fiancée, using my hard-earned money as the foundation. I closed the folder, wiped the screen with my sleeve, and left the iPad exactly where I found it. By the time Julian and Rupert returned from the patio, I was finishing my sparkling water, my expression devoid of any emotion. I survived the rest of the evening playing the role of the tired accountant, excusing myself early. I needed my energy for Sunday. Sunday morning at St. Jude's Parish was never just a religious service for my mother, Margaret. It was a catwalk, a boardroom, and a battlefield for social dominance. The sanctuary held 3,000 people, and Margaret made sure we sat in the 3rd row, right where the live stream cameras would catch our good side. I wore a navy blue shift dress, conservative and appropriate, but the moment I stepped out of my car, my mother swooped down on me like a hawk spotting prey. Margaret wore a lavender suit with a matching fascinator that took up half the airspace around her. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Look at you," she hissed, her smile completely at odds with the venom in her voice. "You look like you're going to a board meeting, Eleanor. Julian is wearing a bespoke Savile Row suit, and you turn up looking like a background extra. You need to treat a good black man right before he finds someone who will. A man like Julian has options." I glanced over at Julian, who was busy shaking hands with the church wardens, flashing his perfectly bleached teeth. "You are entirely right, Mother," I said, my voice deadpan. "He certainly explores his options." Margaret rolled her eyes, missing the implication entirely, and shoved me towards the heavy oak doors. "Keep up appearances, Eleanor. That's all I ask." We took our seats. The choir sang. The collection plates were passed around, and the vicar launched into a passionate sermon about the pillars of a righteous household. The congregation hummed with approval. Then, the vicar stepped down from the pulpit and pointed towards our row. He called Julian by name, praising his recent charitable contributions, which I knew for a fact were made using my current account. "Brother Julian," the vicar boomed, the microphone amplifying his voice across the massive hall. "You are a shining example of a man who leads his home with integrity. Tell these young men how you build such a solid family foundation." Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He took the wireless microphone, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured humility. "It's all about trust, Vicar. You can't build a legacy without absolute transparency and a commitment to your vows. A real man protects what is his." The congregation erupted into polite applause. Several older women called out their agreement. I sat there, listening to a man who had legally divorced me 8 months ago lecture a megachurch on marriage vows. The sheer hypocrisy threatened to choke me. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply leaned forward, projecting my voice clearly into the brief silence that followed the applause. Nothing secures a foundation quite like absolute legal loyalty, right, Julian? Especially when it involves hidden assets and forged paperwork. Amen to transparency. My voice carried further than I intended. The silence that fell over the sanctuary was immediate and suffocating. The applause died instantly. 3,000 heads turned towards our row. The vicar froze, his smile faltering. Julian went rigid, the microphone hovering near his chest. A visible bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, catching the stage lights. He looked at me. Pure terror flashed in his eyes before he quickly masked it with a nervous laugh, trying to play it off as some bizarre inside joke, but the damage was done. Whispers began to rustle through the pews like dry leaves. Margaret looked as though someone had physically struck her. The image was ruined. The flawless facade of middle-class respectability had a massive, glaring crack in it. Before Julian could hand the microphone back, Margaret grabbed my wrist with a vice-like grip. "We need to use the lavatory," she announced to the people sitting next to us, her voice high and frantic. She dragged me out of the pew, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor of the aisle. She didn't let go until we were shoved into the ladies' loos and she had checked beneath the cubicles to ensure we were alone. The moment the heavy wooden door shut, Margaret slapped me hard on the arm. "You have completely lost your mind," she shrieked, her chest heaving. "How dare you embarrass Julian in front of the entire congregation? Do you know who was sitting 2 rows behind us? The local MP. You are trying to destroy this family's reputation because you are bitter and overworked." I rubbed my arm, staring at the woman who gave birth to me. "You're defending him?" I asked quietly. "You don't even know what he's done." "I know he is stressed," Margaret yelled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "I know he is carrying the weight of trying to build a property empire while you sit around counting other people's money. He told me how little you support him. He told me you refuse to use your house as leverage to help his development project with Rupert." My breath caught. "He talked to you about the house." "Of course he did," Margaret snapped, pacing the tiled floor. "He came to me for advice because his own wife won't act like a true partner. You need to sign that property deed over to him, Eleanor. You need to ease his burden. Let him manage the assets so he can finally build generational wealth for this family. If you don't support his vision, he will leave you, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." I looked at my mother, feeling a deep, chilling clarity. She wasn't just an enabler. She was an active participant in my financial execution. She wanted me to sign away the only asset I owned to a man who was actively trying to ruin me, all to maintain the appearance of a wealthy son-in-law. She was willing to leave her own daughter homeless to protect a lie. "My house is going nowhere, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper, "and neither is my money. You should ask Julian about his burden before you worry about mine." I turned my back on her, walked over to the gilded mirrors, and washed my hands. Margaret was still sputtering behind me, demanding respect, demanding I fix the mess I had made in the sanctuary. I dried my hands, ignored her completely, and pushed open the bathroom door. The corridor outside the sanctuary was quiet. The service was still going on behind the closed doors. As I stepped out, I collided sharply with someone rushing in the opposite direction. "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry," a soft, melodic voice said. I looked up. Standing in front of me was a stunning woman. Her skin was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, and she wore a white designer dress that easily cost more than my car. I recognized her instantly from the engagement party guest list I'd found on the iPad. The woman adjusted her designer handbag. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in my face. "Wait," she smiled, a bright, friendly expression completely devoid of malice. "You must be Julian's sister. He talks about his crazy family all the time. I'm Arabella." I forwarded the HR email to my newly retained corporate defense solicitor, attaching the time-stamped bank records and the forged decree absolute. A fabricated restraining order based on mental instability was a desperate, clumsy trick. Julian wanted to trigger the character clause in my employment contract to get me sacked, assuming I'd be too broke to fight his fraudulent transfer of the house deed. But a judge would look at Julian's sudden influx of hidden assets alongside the fraudulent legal documents and immediately throw his petition out. By Thursday afternoon, the injunction was completely dissolved. My firm issued a formal apology to me, acknowledging the malicious nature of Julian's attempt. I didn't shed a single tear over his audacity. I simply marked it down as another piece of financial evidence. Saturday afternoon arrived, bringing with it the mandatory family garden party at my mother Margaret's house. Skipping it wasn't an option. If I stayed home, Julian would control the narrative, painting me entirely as the erratic, isolated woman he claimed I was in his court filings. I arrived on my mother's meticulously manicured lawn wearing a simple summer dress and a calm smile. The smell of hickory smoke, artisanal sausages, and roasted halloumi hung heavy in the humid air. The entire extended family was scattered across the grass, holding paper plates and glasses of Pimm's. I walked into the back garden and immediately spotted Rupert commandeering the massive stainless steel barbecue. He was aggressively wearing an apron that said Grill Master while flipping brisket. Rupert loved these garden parties. He used them as a stage to perform his proximity to black culture, forcing London slang and giving my older relatives unsolicited advice on wealth generation. "Eleanor, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Rupert shouted from across the patio, raising a pair of tongs like a royal scepter. He shifted his register, dropping his voice an octave. "How's the cubicle treating you today? You really need to let Julian and me teach you how to leverage that corporate salary into real assets. You can't just save your way to £1,000,000. You've got to take risks." I grabbed a cold bottle of sparkling water from the cooler. "I will definitely keep that in mind, Rupert." I shifted my attention to the far corner of the patio. Julian was holding court with Uncle Winston and Uncle Clive beneath the canvas awning. He held a plastic cup of beer, shaking his head with a perfectly rehearsed look of profound sadness. "I'm just trying to hold the household together," Julian said, his voice easily carrying over the R&B music playing from the patio speakers. "Her job is really taking a toll on her. She is constantly staring at numbers, and it's making her paranoid, delusional. She actually believes everyone is out to get her. I'm doing everything I can to get her the mental help she needs, but a man can only carry so much weight on his shoulders." Uncle Clive patted Julian on the shoulder, offering a sympathetic nod. "You're a good man, Julian. Keep preying on it. Don't let her stress pull you under." I walked directly towards their circle. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees when Julian noticed my approach. He went rigid. The sad husband act faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced a tragic, welcoming smile. "Eleanor, darling, you made it," Julian said, reaching out to pull me into a hug in front of the uncles. I took a clean step back, leaving his arms grasping at empty air. "I am completely fine, Julian. In fact, my mind has never been clearer. Since we are on the topic of reality versus delusion, I actually have a question for Rupert." I shifted my gaze towards the barbecue. Rupert had stopped flipping the meat, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Rupert," I called out, my voice ringing loud and clear across the back garden, cutting through the music. "Since you're giving free seminars on asset management today, I was hoping you could explain a specific financial strategy to me. What is the exact return on investment when a tow truck repossesses your leased Range Rover SVR at 3 a.m? I'm only asking because my auditing software flagged the attachment order on your primary shell company last Tuesday. Is losing your luxury car part of the master wealth generation plan, or is it just a temporary cash flow hiccup?" The music suddenly felt much too loud. Uncle Winston choked on his beer. Julian went pale as wax. His eyes darted frantically towards the patio doors. Rupert turned a mottled, furious red. The tongs clattered loudly onto the metal rack of the grill. "That is an administrative error," Rupert stammered, completely abandoning his forced cultural accent. "My accountant missed a filing deadline. It's already sorted." Sophie stormed out of the kitchen. The screen door slammed violently against the wooden frame. She marched across the grass, her designer wedges sinking into the soil. "Eleanor, what is wrong with you?" she shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly in my face. "We invite you to our mother's house, and you instantly start ruining the vibe. You are humiliating my husband over a banking error. You are so toxic and negative." My mother, Margaret, shoved her way through the crowd of aunts and cousins who had gone completely silent. She planted herself directly between Sophie and me, glaring at me with absolute disgust. "You have always been exactly like this," Margaret yelled, her voice shaking with rage. "You cannot bear to see anyone else happy. You've been a jealous, bitter woman ever since Aunt Beatrix infected your mind. That crazy old bat filled your head with nonsense, making you think you were better than this family because you could read a spreadsheet. Beatrix died alone because she alienated everyone, and you are heading down the exact same path. Look at your husband. He is practically begging for peace, and you stand here trying to tear your own sister's marriage apart." I looked at my mother, absorbing the venom she so freely weaponized to protect two men who were actively destroying her daughters. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reached into my handbag for my sunglasses. As I pulled them out, my hand intentionally caught the edge of a thick stack of glossy, high-quality cardstock hidden inside my bag. I let the handbag slip from my grasp. It hit the edge of the concrete patio, spilling its contents across the grey stone. The stack of flyers fanned out perfectly across the ground. They were beautifully printed, featuring elegant gold lettering and a stunning photograph of a tropical resort. The bold cursive font at the top of each flyer was impossible to miss. It read, Arabella and Julian, Wedding Registry and Celebration Itinerary. The back garden fell into a deathly silence. Uncle Winston stared at the flyers on the ground, then slowly looked up at Julian. Margaret froze, her mouth slightly ajar as her eyes locked onto the name of her supposedly ideal son-in-law, printed right next to a woman who was decidedly not me. But it was Sophie's reaction that gave everything away. My younger sister didn't gasp in shock. She didn't look at Julian with confusion, anger, or betrayal. Instead, Sophie clamped both hands over her mouth and stared at me in pure, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted wildly from the wedding registry to Rupert, and then back to the ground. She took a large step backwards, physically retreating from the evidence. I looked at my sister, feeling a cold, heavy truth settle permanently into my chest. Sophie wasn't surprised. Sophie already knew. I didn't waste time shouting in the garden. I moved with the precision of a predator finally closing in on its prey. I stepped over the scattered wedding registry flyers. I grabbed my younger sister by the elbow and violently dragged her towards the house. My grip was tight enough to leave bruises, but I kept my face an absolute mask of serenity. Margaret screamed my name from the patio, demanding respect and ordering me to stop embarrassing the family, but I ignored her entirely. I yanked Sophie through the glass sliding doors and shoved her hard into our mother's pristine stainless steel kitchen. The heavy glass door slid shut instantly, cutting off the music and the chaotic murmurs of our extended family. Sophie stumbled slightly against the granite island, rubbing her arm where I had gripped her. She opened her mouth, ready to launch into her usual spoiled victim routine, but she took one look at my face and stopped. The fake innocence evaporated instantly. Her posture shifted drastically. The pampered social media star vanished in a second, replaced by a cornered animal willing to bite to survive. "You knew," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously icy register that demanded absolute silence. "You knew Julian divorced me? You knew he was engaged to another woman? And you invited him to dinner at my house to play me for a fool?" Sophie crossed her arms, tilting her chin up with an arrogant defiance that perfectly mirrored our mother. "So what if I did?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "You were never going to figure it out anyway. You're too busy, buried in your spreadsheets and your boring career, to notice your own marriage was completely dead. Julian came to Rupert and me months ago. He needed an out, Eleanor. He needed a future. A future funded by the equity in my house." I shot back, taking a slow step towards her. "You helped him forge those court documents so he could steal my property." Sophie rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "Oh, please, stop acting like some tragic martyr. We are talking about serious things here. Rupert is drowning in debt. His investors are demanding their money back, and serious fraud office investigators are actively sniffing around his business accounts. If he goes down for corporate fraud, he drags me with him. I lose my brand, my platform, everything I've built. Arabella's father is a billionaire. He is the only one who can write a check large enough to bail Rupert out and make the investigators look the other way. Julian marries Arabella. Her dad saves Rupert, and we all win. You are selling my house and my life to keep your white husband out of Belmarsh prison," I stated, summarizing her pathetic criminal plot. Sophie stepped closer, poking her perfectly manicured finger into my chest, launching into her final defense. "I am preserving this family's legacy. Eleanor, you are just a boring accountant. You have no vision. You come home, wear your dull suits, and offer absolutely nothing to a man like Julian. He's charismatic. He's a builder. Julian deserves a lifestyle that you simply cannot give him. Arabella can give him the world." She let out a harsh, condescending laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Honestly, you should be thanking me. You need to take one for the team. Just sign the TR1 property transfer deed and walk away quietly. Let Julian have the equity. You have a good corporate job. You can easily rent a nice flat somewhere and continue your quiet, lonely life. If you fight this, you'll drag the whole family name through the mud. Mum will never forgive you for ruining our image of Black British excellence over a house. Be the bigger person for once and let Julian move on." She breathed heavily, clearly proud of her vile monologue. She expected me to cry. She expected me to slap her or scream about the injustice of it all. I did none of those things. I simply raised my left wrist and tapped the glowing screen of my Apple Watch. The small red recording icon stopped flashing. The audio file saved directly to my encrypted cloud server. "Thank you, Sophie," I said softly, my voice laced with absolute poison. "I really appreciate you detailing Rupert's federal-level corporate fraud and your active participation in Julian's financial crimes with such excellent audio clarity." My legal team is going to love the acoustics in this kitchen. Sophie stared at my wrist. The arrogant sneer melted into absolute horror. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. "You recorded me," she whispered, her voice trembling as the reality of her confession settled in. Before she could lunge for my wrist, the kitchen door burst open. Rupert stormed into the room. The forced MLE accent he used with my uncles was completely gone. His face was contorted in genuine, unhinged rage. The cool, posh boy facade had entirely shattered, revealing the desperate, entitled scammer underneath. He marched straight up to me, invading my personal space, trying to use his massive height to intimidate me into submission. "Listen to me, you miserable ex-wife," Rupert snarled, his breath smelling of stale beer and pure desperation. "You are going to sign that TR1 property transfer by Friday. If you try to ruin this deal with Arabella's family, I will personally ruin your pathetic career. I know powerful people at your auditing firm. I'll tell them you're stealing client data. I'll make sure you never work in corporate finance again. You sign the house over to Julian, or I will destroy you." I looked up at his red, sweaty face. I didn't step back. I smiled. It was a wide, terrifying, triumphant smile. I reached into my handbag, ignoring my sunglasses, and pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. I slipped the card directly into the breast pocket of Rupert's expensive linen suit. "You don't need to ring my firm to ruin me, Rupert," I whispered smoothly. "You just need to ring your primary creditor." Rupert frowned, pulling the card from his pocket. He stared at the bold white lettering printed across the matte black background. It was the exact name of the private limited company that currently owned the predatory debt on every single one of his failing businesses. The company that could legally seize his assets tomorrow morning. I watched his eyes dart to the bottom of the card, landing on the title printed right beneath the company name, Eleanor, Chief Executive Officer. I left Rupert standing in my mother's kitchen, staring at the matte black business card that held the key to his financial ruin, and walked out the front door. My phone buzzed twice with frantic calls from Sophie, but I switched it to Do Not Disturb. I had a schedule to keep, and Julian was the next item on my itinerary. When I walked through the front door of my own house, the air felt thick with anticipation. Julian was standing in the living room, aggressively shoving designer dress shirts into a dark leather holdall. He wore a crisply ironed white shirt, playing the part of the busy corporate executive to the very end. He looked up when I shut the door, flashing a tired, affectionate smile that turned my stomach. "Hi, darling," Julian said, zipping up a side pocket. "I am so sorry, but I've got a last-minute business trip. The regional director needs me in Dubai to close a massive software deal. I'll be gone until Monday. I know the timing is terrible with everything happening right now, but this commission is going to set us up for the next 5 years." I set my handbag on the hallway table. "Dubai. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity for you." He stepped over to the kitchen worktop and picked up a manila folder. "Yeah, it's a game changer." "Oh, before I forget." He slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the polished granite. "My accountant sent over the final documents for our joint tax return. We need to leverage the property depreciation to offset my capital gains from last quarter. I need your signature on the last page before I head to Heathrow so I can courier it to his office tonight." I looked at the document. It wasn't a tax return. It was a standard TR1 transfer of portfolio document, slightly reformatted to look like a scheduled asset form. He had buried the property transfer language in the middle of dense, fabricated legal jargon, assuming my grief over Aunt Beatrix and the stress of my job would blind me to the details. He honestly believed I would just blindly sign away the house I bought to help with his imaginary tax burden. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice incredibly light. "We definitely want to make sure your assets are fully protected." I reached into my handbag and bypassed the standard black ink pens I used for official client work. Instead, I pulled out a sleek silver pen with a very specific blue ink cartridge. It was a friction-fading thermal ink pen, a tool we used occasionally in forensic auditing to temporarily mark physical ledgers. The ink adhered to paper, looking beautifully legitimate and permanent. But when exposed to normal room temperature air for exactly 24 hours, the chemical compound broke down entirely. The ink vanished without a trace, leaving a perfectly blank page. I clicked the pen, leaned over the granite worktop, and signed my name with a grand flourish right on the dotted line. Julian watched the blue ink sink into the paper. A look of profound, greedy triumph washed over his face. He snatched the document off the worktop so fast he nearly tore the page, tucking it safely into a waterproof plastic sleeve before shoving it into his leather holdall. "Thank you, Eleanor," Julian said, letting out a deep breath he had clearly been holding. "You are a true partner. This is going to change everything for us. I promise you, By this time next week, we are going to be living an entirely different lifestyle. I crossed my arms, leaning against the cold fridge door. I don't doubt that for a second, Julian. By the way, I said, keeping my tone as conversational as if I were asking about the weather. How is Arabella's father doing these days? I heard the Silicon Valley tech market has been incredibly volatile this quarter. I hope his portfolio is holding up. Julian froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the heavy leather straps of his holdall, stopped dead in midair. The colour drained from his face so rapidly his skin took on a sickly, greyish hue. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy leather bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, echoing thud. I didn't wait for his excuses. I didn't ask for an explanation about his upcoming engagement party. I just smiled a bright, cheerful expression that didn't reach my eyes. Have a great flight to Dubai, Julian. Enjoy the trip. I turned my back on my ex-husband, walked straight out the front door, and got back into my car. I drove into the city, leaving him paralyzed in the hallway. I pulled into the underground car park of a high-rise legal building and took the private lift straight to the top floor. My corporate solicitor, Mr. Davis, was waiting for me in the glass-walled conference room. The paperwork is ready, Eleanor, Mr. Davis said, sliding 2 massive folders across the mahogany table. I opened the first folder. It contained the court orders I was executing against Rupert's shell companies. I signed my name with a permanent, legally binding black pen. With those signatures, my limited company officially initiated the repossession of every single corporate asset Rupert owned. His bank accounts were frozen. His corporate credit lines were dead. The luxury Mayfair penthouse he rented with Sophie was now marked for immediate eviction. I pulled the second folder towards me. This one was much more destructive. It contained the complete forensic dossier to ruin Julian tonight. We'll print multiple copies, I ordered, tapping the folder. We are delivering this to Arabella's billionaire father before the party even begins. I left the law firm with the heavy folders secured in my briefcase. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, but he was barely managing drafts. My auditing firm handled the escrow accounts for the most exclusive event planners in the city, including the woman currently orchestrating Arabella's extravagant bridal shower. A quick phone call to the planner, citing a random compliance check on vendor payouts, guaranteed my name was placed on the VIP guest list at the Wentworth Club. The venue was a sprawling estate of manicured golf courses and generational wealth in the home counties. This was the exact kind of elite, historically exclusive space Julian was desperate to infiltrate. He craved the validation of high society, believing that marrying into a billionaire tech family would finally grant him the status he felt he deserved. I walked past the valet, ignoring the inquiring stares of the wealthy guests. I wore a bespoke crimson trouser suit that demanded absolute attention. Striding through the grand mahogany doors with the confidence of a woman who owned the building, I entered the conservatory. Crystal chandeliers hung above tables draped in white silk. Women in pastel dresses sipped Prosecco, laughed politely, and discussed their summer homes. In the center of the room stood Arabella, glowing in a pale pink dress, surrounded by a mountain of expensive gifts wrapped in silver paper. I walked up to her table with the quiet, measured precision of an executioner. I waited until her friends scattered for another round of drinks from the open bar. Arabella turned, spotting me. Her bright, camera-ready smile faltered for a fraction of a second before her high society training kicked in. "You made it," she said, her voice dropping to a deeply sympathetic whisper. "Julian told me you might not feel comfortable in crowds today. He said your mental health has been a real struggle lately. I am so glad you felt well enough to leave the house and come see me. I promise you, we are going to find you a lovely, quiet care facility once the wedding is over. My father knows some excellent private doctors who can help you." I kept my face completely neutral. "He told you I struggle with my mental health?" "Yes," Arabella nodded, looking around nervously as if I might suddenly start screaming and ruin the aesthetic of her party. "He explained everything. It must be so difficult dealing with your condition. He said he's been letting his distant cousin stay in his house because you refused to leave and had nowhere else to go." The sheer audacity of Julian's lies almost made me laugh. He didn't just demote me from wife to sister at the church. When the pressure of his impending wedding mounted, he demoted me to a homeless, mentally unstable cousin who refused to vacate his property. "I am not his cousin, Arabella," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, authoritative tone. "I am his ex-wife of 8 months. Arabella froze. Her manicured hand gripped the edge of the gift table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Excuse me?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick, leather-bound dossier my solicitor had just prepared. I am the woman who pays the mortgage on the house he currently sleeps in. I am the forensic auditor who just spent the last 48 hours tracking every single lie he has told your family to secure his place in this country club. I slid the folder across the white silk tablecloth. It clinked softly against a silver champagne flute. "Open it, Arabella." Arabella stared at the folder. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Her hands shook slightly as she reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was the decree absolute, clearly showing the judge's signature and the finalization date from exactly 8 months ago. The second page was a highly detailed financial flowchart I had mapped out myself that morning. "Julian does not have a property empire," I explained, my voice steady and low so only she could hear the absolute destruction of her future. "He is completely bankrupt. That £7,500 engagement ring currently sitting on your finger was purchased using my personal credit card, which I have since permanently frozen. He forged our divorce papers to hide his financial ruin from your father. He knew a standard legal discovery process would expose his empty bank accounts. He is currently funneling money from your family's accounts to pay off the massive federal fraud debts of my sister's husband, Rupert." Arabella stared at the highlighted bank statements showing the desperate movement of funds. The color drained completely from her flawless face. Her chest heaved as she struggled to comprehend the absolute demolition of her fairy tale romance. She was looking at hard, undeniable forensic proof that the man she loved was nothing more than a highly skilled parasite. Before she could utter a single word of defense or denial, her custom gold smartphone began to vibrate violently against the table. The caller ID displayed her father's name. She picked it up with a trembling hand, pressing the device to her ear. "Hello, Daddy?" Arabella listened for exactly 5 seconds. I watched her posture collapse entirely. I saw the reality hit her like a physical blow, shattering the wealthy, carefree illusion she had been living in. "What do you mean the multi-million-pound bridging loan disappeared?" she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking as her eyes darted back to me in absolute horror. "He said the transfer was processing into the business accounts today." I smiled, reaching out to gently close the heavy leather folder on the table. "The transfer didn't process, Arabella," I said quietly, timing my words perfectly as her billionaire father screamed through the phone's speaker. "I legally froze that capital at 9 a.m. Enjoy the party." I walked out of the Wentworth Club with the crisp air filling my lungs, leaving Arabella staring at her dead future. My phone buzzed in my hand with a notification from my legal team. The court order had been officially signed by the judge. The bridging loan was permanently frozen, and the repossession of Rupert's primary holding company was greenlit. Julian was suffocating in the disaster he had created himself, but I wasn't finished yet. It was time to deal with the sister who told me to take one for the team. I slid into the back seat of my waiting town car and gave the driver an address in the most expensive postcode in Mayfair. Sophie and Rupert lived in a sprawling multi-million-pound penthouse with panoramic views of the city skyline. Sophie loved posting daily videos, touring the marble kitchen and custom walk-in wardrobes, claiming it was the fruit of her manifestation and Rupert's property genius. In reality, the property was legally owned by Rupert's primary shell company, the exact same company I now held all the predatory debt for. Because he had defaulted on the bridging loan months ago, the asset was legally mine to repossess. My car pulled up outside the gleaming glass facade of the high-rise building. Waiting for me in the lobby was a high court enforcement officer, holding a thick stack of official repossession and eviction notices. Beside him stood 2 massive, highly trained private security contractors I had hired that morning. We didn't stop at the concierge desk. We walked straight to the private lifts, swiped the master keycard my legal team had obtained from building management, and rode up to the penthouse floor. When the heavy brass lift doors opened, depositing us directly into the open-concept living area, the scene unfolding was absolutely pathetic. Sophie was pacing back and forth in front of a ring light, holding her smartphone up to her face. She was in the middle of a frantic Instagram live stream. Tears streamed down her meticulously contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She wore a designer silk robe, clutching a tissue to her chest, delivering the performance of a lifetime to her thousands of followers. "Guys," Sophie sobbed to her phone camera, her voice high-pitched and hysterical, "you have to understand how targeted we are right now. Rupert and I have built this incredible life, and now this corrupt, shadowy banking corporation is trying to steal our home. They are freezing our accounts for absolutely no reason. It is systemic oppression. They can't stand seeing a successful black woman living her dream, so they are sending thugs to throw us out of our own penthouse. Please share this stream. We need to expose this corruption." I didn't wait for her to finish her digital pity party. I stepped out of the lift and walked directly into the frame of her live stream. I looked straight into the camera lens, holding up the stack of legal documents. There is no corrupt banking corporation, Sophie, I stated clearly, ensuring every single one of her followers heard my voice. It's just me. And you are being evicted because your husband is a fraudster who hasn't paid his commercial mortgage in 7 months. Sophie shrieked, dropping her hand so fast the camera pointed directly at the floor. Eleanor, what are you doing here? She screamed, her voice cracking with genuine panic. Get out of my house! It isn't your house, I corrected smoothly, dropping the heavy repossession documents onto her pristine glass coffee table. The loud smack echoed through the massive room. It belongs to the limited company I now legally own. You have exactly 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and vacate my property. A door down the hallway flew open. Rupert stormed into the living room. His face was a mask of absolute unhinged fury. The cool, progressive white boy act he used to charm my mother and uncles was completely gone. He puffed out his chest, clenching his fists, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. You crazy, bitter woman, Rupert roared, getting so close I could smell expensive whiskey on his breath and pure desperation. You think you can just break into my home? I'm calling the police right now. I'll have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. We'll see how tough you are when the Met drag you out of here in handcuffs. He reached for his phone, intending to weaponize his white privilege against me, expecting me to cower at the threat of the law. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I simply tilted my head and gestured gracefully towards the lift doors. That won't be necessary, Rupert, I said calmly. I brought the authorities with me. The High Court enforcement officer stepped out of the shadows of the lift shaft, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. My 2 armed private security guards flanked him, crossing their arms and staring Rupert down. Rupert froze. The colour drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the marble floor. His entire shield of privilege shattered in a single second. He looked at the enforcement officer, then at the official eviction notices on the table, and finally realized he had absolutely no way out. The shell companies were dead. The money was gone. The penthouse was lost. His panic immediately morphed into vicious, misdirected rage. Rupert spun around, his eyes locked onto Sophie, who was paralyzed by her ring light. "This is your fault!" Rupert screamed at his wife, the venom in his voice stripping away years of fake affection. "Your entire family is toxic trash. You demanded the designer bags, the luxury cars, the penthouse. You needed to look like a superstar online, and I bankrupted myself trying to afford your fake aesthetic. I didn't even love you, Sophie. I just needed your dad's old connections to get my foot in the door, and you were too self-obsessed to see it. You are nothing but a shallow, useless liability." Sophie gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. The golden child, the sister who had told me to take one for the team, completely crumbled. She fell to her knees, sobbing hysterically, reaching a trembling hand out towards me. "Eleanor, please," Sophie begged, tears and mascara streaming down her chin. "You can't let them throw me out. I have nowhere to go. Mum won't let me move back home. Please. I'm your sister. Help me." I looked down at the woman who had happily conspired to steal my house and fund her lavish lifestyle with my destruction. She was surrounded by empty, scattered designer shopping bags. I adjusted the strap of my handbag. "You wanted his lifestyle, Sophie," I said, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "Now you get to keep his debts." I turned my back on her, literally stepping over a pile of her expensive leather bags. I walked into the lift with the enforcement officer and my security team closely behind. The brass doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of Rupert screaming and Sophie begging, leaving them trapped in the spectacular ruin of their own making. I walked out of the luxury building, climbed into the back seat of my waiting car, and instructed my driver to take me back to my corporate office. I had a busy afternoon ahead, and my family was rapidly running out of moves. At 2 p.m. the next day, the silence in my glass-walled office was violently shattered. The door to my office burst open with such force the glass vibrated against the metal frame. My mother, Margaret, stormed into the room, shoving past my frantic assistant. Margaret was dressed in an impeccable white church suit, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed her designer handbag down onto my desk, scattering my neatly organized financial reports. "How dare you?" Margaret screamed, her voice echoing down the corporate corridor. "You have completely lost your mind. Sophie has been crying hysterically in my spare room all night. She had to leave her designer wardrobe behind. You evicted your own sister from her home. You are going to call off those security guards. You are going to give Sophie her penthouse back, and you are going to stop trying to destroy Black British excellence in this family." I signaled to my assistant that everything was fine. He quickly shut the door, leaving me alone with the woman who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me to fit into her narrow aesthetic. I didn't stand up. I leaned back in my leather chair, interlacing my fingers. Black British excellence, I repeated slowly, letting the phrase roll off my tongue. Mother, there is absolutely no excellence in renting a penthouse you cannot afford. There is no excellence in Sophie faking her wealth on social media while her white husband commits federal-level corporate fraud. That isn't excellence. That is an embarrassing financial disaster masquerading as a lifestyle. Margaret planted both hands on my desk, leaning over me with a sneer. You are just bitter, Eleanor. You have always been bitter. You let that crazy Aunt Beatrix poison your mind. You think having money gives you the right to disrespect the family structure? I felt a surge of protective anger for the woman who had actually loved me. Do not bring Aunt Beatrix into this, I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. You banished your own sister from this family because she was too dark-skinned. She wore her hair natural and refused to play your ridiculous respectability politics. You told everyone she was a crazy outcast because she didn't care about designer labels or country club memberships. But guess what, Mother? That eccentric outcast built a £28 million tech fortune while you were busy taking out loans to buy church hats. Beatrix built actual generational wealth. You just built a facade. Margaret straightened up, her chest heaving. Deep colour rushed into her cheeks. She pointed a trembling finger at me, playing her desperate final card. Listen to me very carefully. If you do not reverse that eviction right now and sign your house over to Julian to fix this mess, you are no longer my daughter. I will disown you completely. You will be dead to this family. She expected me to break. She expected the 3-4-year-old woman who had always craved her mother's approval to start begging for forgiveness. Instead, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick red manila folder. I tossed it onto the desk, right next to her expensive handbag. I highly recommend you sit down before you disown me, Mother, I said softly, because you are going to need my help to stay out of a high-security prison. Margaret frowned, her confidence wavering. She cautiously opened the red folder. Inside was a complete, highly detailed forensic audit of the St. Jude's Parish Building Fund. Margaret was the head of the Church Finance Committee. It was her pride and joy, the ultimate symbol of her social power in our community. I've spent the last 12 hours tracking Julian's financial movements, I explained, watching Margaret's eyes scan the highlighted bank statements. Did you know Julian managed the payouts to external contractors for the church's new roof? Because he didn't hire contractors. He siphoned exactly £50,000 from the church building fund directly into his personal current account. He used your church's charity money to pay for the deposit on Arabella's wedding venue. Margaret gasped, bringing her hand to her mouth. She dropped the folder, backing away from the desk as if the papers were on fire. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Julian would never do that. He is a good Christian man. Numbers don't pray, Mother, and they certainly don't lie, I said coldly. As head of the finance committee, you signed off on those transfers without verifying the vendor accounts. In the eyes of HMRC and the Serious Fraud Office, that makes you an active accomplice to criminal embezzlement. When this goes public, you won't just lose your seat at the church. You will face felony charges for stealing from your own congregation. Margaret collapsed into the guest chair. The arrogant, demanding matriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a terrified woman realizing her entire social kingdom was burning to the ground. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, finally understanding the absolute power I held over her fate. What do you want? She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. I want you to experience exactly what transparency feels like, I said, leaning over my desk. This Sunday, you are going to walk up to the pulpit, take the microphone, and publicly denounce Julian in front of the entire congregation. You will confess that he stole the charity money, and you will apologize for enabling a fraudster. If you do not make that announcement by the end of the morning service, I will submit this entire red folder directly to the Parochial Church Council and the Criminal Investigation Division of HMRC. Margaret let out a broken, agonizing sob. She buried her face in her hands, weeping uncontrollably as the reality of her social execution set in. She had to choose between destroying her precious son-in-law or going to prison. I sat in silence, watching the woman who had called me a bitter disappointment cry over the ruins of her fake empire. I left Margaret sobbing in my office, illuminating my left monitor. I had absolutely no time to indulge my mother's belated tears. I needed to focus on the two men currently trying to salvage their sinking ship. Before Julian zipped up his leather holdall for his fake business trip to Dubai, I had slipped a micro GPS tracker with audio capabilities into the lining. It was a piece of military-grade tech, a parting gift from one of Aunt Beatrix's paranoid, brilliant Silicon Valley engineers. The blinking red dot on my screen showed Julian was nowhere near Heathrow Airport. He was parked on the 5th level of a dimly lit concrete NCP car park right here in the city. A second blue dot, representing the latest leased SUV from Rupert's company, pulled up right beside him. I slipped on my noise-cancelling headphones, hit a key on my keyboard, and connected directly to the live audio feed. The acoustics of the concrete car park amplified every desperate, panic-stricken breath the two men took. Julian slammed his car door, his voice echoing loudly. "What do you mean you've been kicked out of the penthouse? You told me the planning permissions were sorted. Arabella's dad is asking questions about the bridging loan transfer. I look like a complete idiot." Rupert didn't sound anything like the arrogant property mogul who had mocked my career just days earlier. His voice was frantic, edging on hysteria. "Eleanor bought the debt. Julian, your quiet little accountant wife somehow funneled enough capital through an opaque limited company to buy out my primary creditors. The High Court bailiff literally escorted me out of my own living room. Sophie is having a complete mental breakdown in a hotel lobby, and my investors are demanding an emergency audit. You need to use your house as leverage right now. Take the deed you made her sign. Take it to a private lender and get me a cash advance before the SFO turns up at my office." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, adjusting the volume. The desperation was palpable. "I can't leverage the house until the land registry processes the transfer of ownership." Julian screamed, his polished corporate composure completely shattered. "Expedited processing takes at least 48 hours. You told me this was a foolproof plan, Rupert. You said we'd use Eleanor's equity to save your commercial project. I marry Arabella, and her billionaire dad covers the rest. Now I am standing here with zero cash, a frozen bridging loan, and a furious fiancé who thinks I'm running a scam." "You are running a scam!" Rupert roared, the sound of his fist slamming onto the bonnet of a car echoing through my headphones. "You forged your own divorce papers to hide your bankrupt reality from a billionaire heiress. Do not try and take the moral high ground with me. Listen to me very carefully. If federal investigators raid my shell companies tomorrow morning, I am not going down alone. I have the paper trail proving you authorized those fake invoices to siphon money from the church building fund. I will hand that evidence directly to the National Crime Agency and tell them you masterminded the entire wire fraud operation. I will pin every single fraudulent transfer directly on you." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the sudden realization that there is no honor among thieves. Julian let out a low, dangerous laugh. It was the sound of a cornered rat baring its teeth. "You want to play it like that, Rupert? Go ahead. Ring the authorities. But before you do, you might want to consider what happens when your black investors see the group chats you left open on my iPad." Rupert's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about those late-night text threads with your country club mates," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "The ones where you bragged about using your black wife as a diversity prop to secure minority business grants. The ones where you called Uncle Winston and the rest of my family highly profitable council estate trash. How long do you think you'll survive in this city when I leak those racist messages to every single investor you scammed? They won't just sue you. They will tear you apart in the streets." I sat in my office, my blood running cold. I knew Rupert was a culture vulture, a man who performed proximity to blackness only when it benefited his bank account. But hearing the absolute, unfiltered racism confirming he saw my family as nothing more than profitable council estate trash solidified my resolve. I wasn't just going to ruin them financially, I was going to break them psychologically. I opened a specialized software program on my desktop, another beautiful tool from Aunt Beatrix's network. I pinpointed the exact Bluetooth frequencies of their two parked vehicles. With a few rapid keystrokes, I bypassed their security protocols and hijacked the audio systems of both luxury cars simultaneously in the car park. Julian and Rupert were still circling each other, trading vicious threats of prison and public ruin. I hit a button on my keyboard. Suddenly, their own voices blasted out of the surround sound speakers of both vehicles. The concrete walls of the car park shook with the playback. "I will pin every single fraudulent transfer directly on you," Rupert's recorded voice boomed like thunder. "How long do you think you'll survive when I leak those racist messages?" Julian's voice rumbled back. Through my headphones, I heard both men scream in pure terror. They stumbled backwards, terrified by the disembodied playback of their own mutual betrayal. I leaned into my microphone, projecting my voice directly into their panic-stricken silence. "You both have excellent projection," I said smoothly, my voice echoing through the garage speakers. "But your loyalty needs serious work. I have the entire conversation saved to multiple secure cloud servers. Enjoy the paranoia, gentlemen." Before either man could formulate a response to my voice falling from the sky, a sharp ping sounded on the audio feed. It was the distinctive notification sound of an urgent email arriving on Julian's phone. I smiled, already knowing exactly what the message said. Julian scrambled to pull his phone from his pocket. I heard him gasp a pathetic, strangled sound of absolute defeat. It was an automated notification from the County Land Registry Office regarding his expedited property transfer request. Your TR1 transfer request has been officially rejected. Invalid document due to missing signature. The thermal fading ink had vanished entirely. The page was blank. Julian was officially out of time, out of money, and completely out of options. Julian stared at his phone screen in the echoing car park, the rejection notice burning into his retinas. The blank TR1 deed meant his entire master plan had just evaporated into thin air. He had no house, no equity, and no bridging loan to secure his future, but he still had a billionaire heiress waiting for him across town. He shoved his phone into his pocket, wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, and drove his leased sports car towards his only remaining lifeline. The engagement party was being held at a sprawling, ultra-exclusive waterfront estate in the home counties, owned by Arabella's father, Alistair. The mansion was a monument to Silicon Valley tech money, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking a private marina. A string quartet played on the manicured lawn. Waiters in immaculate white dinner jackets carried silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. Julian handed his keys to the valet. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped them onto the pavement. He smoothed down the jacket of his bespoke tuxedo, desperately trying to project the image of a wealthy, successful entrepreneur who belonged in this world. When Julian stepped into the grand ballroom, the reality of his crumbling world was impossible to ignore. Rupert was slumped over the marble bar in the far corner, downing his third glass of neat whiskey. The arrogant property developer had completely vanished. Rupert looked like an empty shell of a man, his eyes bloodshot and his linen suit deeply wrinkled. He knew federal investigators were closing in on his fraudulent operations. Across the room, my mother Margaret and my sister Sophie were huddled near a massive floral arrangement. They were entirely stripped of their usual loud, demanding arrogance, surrounded by actual billionaires. Their fake social media wealth and church committee status meant absolutely nothing here. Sophie was nervously twisting her fingers, her eyes darting around the room in pure panic. Margaret looked physically ill, terrified that the church audit I held over her head was about to detonate at any second. They were cornered rats hiding in the shadows of a party they did not belong to. I arrived exactly 30 minutes later. My chauffeured car glided up the circular driveway, pulling to a stop right at the grand entrance of the estate. I stepped out wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that flowed like liquid silk. I walked up the wide marble steps with the absolute certainty of a woman who held the financial fate of everyone inside in her hands. 2 massive private security guards blocked the carved wooden doors. One of them held a heavy clipboard, stepping forward to block my path. "I'm sorry, madam," the guard said, his voice flat and authoritative. "This is a high-security private event. You are not on the guest list. I cannot let you inside." I smiled calmly, adjusting my velvet clutch. I am exactly where I need to be. Before the guard could ask me to leave, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Alistair, Arabella's father, the ruthless tech titan who controlled billions in global assets, stepped out onto the landing. He ignored the security guards completely. Alistair extended his hand towards me, his face lighting up with a warm, deeply respectful smile. "Eleanor," Alistair boomed, his voice carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "I am so glad you could make it. Please come in." The security guards immediately dropped their hands and stepped back, their eyes widening in sudden deference. Alistair offered me his arm, escorting me through the grand doors as if I were a visiting head of state. We entered the ballroom together. The conversational hum of the elite continued, but I felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere. I looked across the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. My eyes met Julian's directly. He was standing near the towering ice sculpture, a frosted flute of champagne frozen halfway to his mouth. He stared at me in absolute horror. He watched the billionaire host of the party escort his supposedly unstable, broke ex-wife into the room with profound reverence. Then, Julian's eyes dropped to my collarbone. Resting against my skin was a breathtaking vintage diamond necklace. It was a massive, flawless piece of jewelry valued at over £200,000. Julian recognized it instantly. It was Aunt Beatrix's most famous heirloom, the one she wore to family events solely to irritate my mother. Julian realized in that exact second that I hadn't just bought Rupert's debt. I was the silent financial powerhouse that had taken over his entire world. The color vanished completely from his face. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of a cocktail table to stay standing. He looked at Rupert, who was staring at me with his mouth hanging open in pure terror. Sophie let out a small, audible gasp from the corner, hiding her face behind her mother's shoulder. Alistair led me to the center of the room, positioning me right beside the grand staircase, where Arabella stood looking completely detached. Alistair grabbed a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the massive ballroom, silencing the string quartet and halting all conversation. The room fell perfectly silent. Alistair cleared his throat, his authoritative gaze sweeping over the crowd of elite investors, tech executives, and my terrified, fraudulent family members. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight in my home," Alistair announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I know you all received invitations for a very specific type of celebration. However, plans have changed significantly in the last 48 hours. Alistair turned slightly, offering me a respectful nod before looking directly at Julian. "Tonight, we are not celebrating an engagement. We are celebrating a new corporate merger." I smiled fully at Julian, ready to deliver the final, devastating blow to his shattered ego. Alistair stepped aside, extending his hand towards me. He offered me the elegant silver microphone with a gesture of profound respect. The ballroom, filled with tech titans and high society elites, grew so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in their cocktail glasses. Julian was frozen near the ice sculpture, his breathing shallow and rapid. I took the microphone, feeling the cold metal against my palm. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch, forcing Julian to endure every agonizing second of his impending ruin. "Thank you, Alistair," I said, my voice ringing crystal clear across the cavernous space. "And thank you all for being here. As Alistair mentioned, tonight we are not celebrating an engagement. We are actually here to celebrate a remarkably efficient legal maneuver executed by the man of the hour." I directed my gaze straight at Julian. He looked as though he was going to vomit on the polished marble floor. "I want to publicly thank Julian for a very specific gift he gave me exactly 8 months ago," I continued, walking slowly down the landing of the grand staircase. "It was a gift he secured behind my back using a highly skilled forgery of my signature. He gave me the gift of a decree absolute." A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the elegant crowd. Arabella stood beside her father, her face a mask of absolute detachment, sipping her champagne. "You see, Julian wanted to protect his future billionaire lifestyle from his boring accountant wife," I explained, projecting my voice effortlessly. "He forged our divorce to separate our assets, planning to evict me from my own home once he secured his new bride. He thought he was executing a financial masterstroke, but Julian has always been terrible at maths." I raised my left hand and snapped my fingers. At the back of the room, the AV technicians followed my prearranged instructions. The massive digital screens flanking the grand staircase, which had previously displayed romantic slideshows of Julian and Arabella, flickered and changed instantly. On the left screen appeared a high-definition image of the county-stamped decree absolute. The forged signature was magnified for everyone to see. On the right screen, a redacted but incredibly clear bank statement from my new opaque limited company flashed in bright white numbers against a dark background. The crowd gasped simultaneously. The bottom line of the bank statement read, £28 million. When Julian legally severed our marriage 8 months ago, I announced, ensuring every syllable hit him like a physical blow, he completely disqualified himself from the inheritance I received from my late Aunt Beatrix on Tuesday. By trying to hide his massive debts and protect a fortune he didn't even have yet, Julian officially divorced himself from £28 million. Julian let out a pathetic, strangled noise. His legs gave out entirely. He collapsed to his knees in front of the entire assembled elite, staring at the massive screens. The magnitude of his catastrophic greed crushed whatever was left of his spirit. He had abandoned a loyal wife and committed federal-level fraud to pursue a scam, losing a real mega-fortune in the process. I offered him not 1 ounce of pity. I shifted my attention towards the back of the ballroom, near the heavy mahogany exit doors. My mother, Margaret, was desperately trying to slip out unseen. She had her designer handbag clutched to her chest, her head ducked in a pathetic attempt to evade the consequences. "Leaving already, Mother?" I called out over the sound system. Margaret froze, her hand hovering just inches from the brass door handle. The crowd parted around her, leaving her completely exposed beneath the brilliant chandeliers. "I noticed you brought several prominent members of St. Jude's Parish to celebrate tonight," I said, making direct eye contact with Churchwarden Miller and Mrs. Washington, who were standing near the bar. Margaret has always prioritized the church community and her image of Black British excellence above all else, so it's only fair that her community knows exactly how this lavish party was funded. Churchwarden Miller frowned, setting his drink down. Margaret slowly turned around. Tears of absolute panic streamed down her meticulously contoured face. She shook her head silently, begging me to stop. I ignored her entirely. As head of the Church Finance Committee, Margaret personally authorised the transfer of £50,000 from the charity fund for the new roof directly into Julian's personal current account, I revealed, my voice echoing with undeniable authority. Julian used the donation money from your congregation to pay the deposit on this very venue. My mother prioritised the illusion of a wealthy son-in-law over the security and trust of her own church. The backlash was instantaneous. Mrs. Washington let out a horrified shriek. Churchwarden Miller marched directly towards Margaret, demanding answers. Margaret's knees buckled. She sank against the mahogany doors, sobbing loudly as the social standing she valued more than her own daughter disintegrated into ash. The people she had desperately tried to impress now looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Billionaires were whispering, pointing at Julian grovelling on the floor. Church members were shouting at my weeping mother. I stood on the staircase, watching my family's toxic empire burn to the ground. Suddenly, the sharp, violent sound of shattering glass pierced the uproar. Rupert had hurled his heavy rocks glass directly against the mirrored wall of the bar. He stood there, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying shade of purple. The alcohol had stripped away every last ounce of his cultured, progressive facade. He realized his shell companies were dead, his penthouse was repossessed, and his impending federal prison sentence was sealed by the black woman he had constantly mocked. Rupert completely broke. He let out a wild, unhinged roar and charged through the crowd directly at me, screaming vicious, unfiltered racial slurs at the top of his lungs. I didn't flinch. I stood perfectly still on the marble landing, watching a grown man reduce himself to a rabid animal because his privilege could no longer protect his incompetence. Rupert vaulted over a shattered table, his face a terrifying mask of sweaty rage, spitting hateful slurs that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The startled billionaire guests scattered, abandoning their champagne flutes to flee his violent path. But before Rupert could reach the first step of the staircase, a blur of black tuxedo fabric slammed into him from the side. It was Julian. Julian didn't tackle his brother-in-law to protect me. Julian threw his entire body weight against Rupert, because Alistair, the tech titan who held the keys to the kingdom, was standing right beside me. Julian was desperately executing one last pathetic performance to salvage his relationship with Arabella's family. The two men crashed violently onto the polished marble floor. They rolled into a towering pyramid of crystal champagne flutes, sending shards and gallons of expensive vintage liquor cascading around them. Rupert threw a brutal punch that connected squarely with Julian's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone on bone echoed above the terrified gasps of the crowd. Julian roared in pain, grabbing Rupert by the collar of his ruined linen suit and slamming his head against the floor. They fought like cornered dogs in the middle of a billionaire's ballroom. The facade of their wealthy brotherhood was entirely obliterated. Rupert clawed at Julian's bespoke tuxedo, ripping the fabric, screaming that Julian had ruined his life. Julian punched him again, screaming that Rupert was a racist fraudster who dragged him into a federal investigation. They were destroying each other, doing my work for me. Alistair's private security team finally swarmed the floor. 4 massive men in tactical gear grabbed the brawling cowards, ripping them apart and forcing them to their knees amidst the broken glass. Both men panted, their faces bloody and bruised, their expensive clothes completely ruined. Julian wiped the blood from his split lip, looking frantically up towards the top of the stairs. He ignored me entirely. His desperate, pleading eyes locked onto Arabella. "Arabella," Julian gasped, his voice shaking as he tried to catch his breath. "Please, you have to understand. I was trying to protect you from him. He's a criminal. I tackled him to keep you safe. We can still fix this. I love you." Arabella didn't look at him with love, and she certainly didn't look at him with pity. She slowly descended the marble staircase, her pale pink designer gown gliding over the steps. She stopped right in front of where Julian was kneeling on the floor, restrained by her father's security guards. She held a glass full of dark red wine in her right hand. Julian looked up at her, offering a pathetic, hopeful smile. Arabella tilted her glass and poured the entire contents directly over his head. The dark red liquid soaked into his hair, ran down his bruised face, and stained the pristine white collar of his ruined tuxedo shirt. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a humiliated whimper as the wine dripped from his chin onto the marble floor. "You don't love me, Julian," Arabella said, her voice dropping to a glacial, terrifyingly calm register. "You loved my father's bank accounts. You are bankrupt. You are a fraud, and you are absolutely pathetic. Do not ever speak to me again." Arabella turned her back on him, gracefully walking up the stairs to stand beside her father. Julian slumped forward. The reality of his total social and financial destruction finally broke him. He had lost the heiress, the mansion, the status, and the money, all in 30 minutes. But the night wasn't over yet. The heavy mahogany doors at the entrance to the ballroom suddenly swung open again. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from scandalous social drama to harsh criminal reality. A team of 6 officers walked into the room, their dark windbreakers clearly displaying the bold white letters of the National Crime Agency. They moved with absolute authority, parting the crowd with ease. Alistair had kept his promise after I handed him the forensic dossier at the country club. He didn't just freeze the bridging loan, he rang his personal contacts at the SFO and the NCA. The lead officer walked straight past the shattered bar and stopped in front of the 2 bleeding men kneeling on the floor. "Rupert," the officer barked, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of corporate fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." Rupert began to sob uncontrollably as the cold steel clicked shut around his wrists. The arrogant property developer who had mocked my auditing career was reduced to a broken, weeping criminal. The second officer stepped forward, pulling out his own set of handcuffs and looking directly at Julian. "Julian," the officer said, grabbing Julian by the shoulder and hauling him to his feet. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and the forgery of legal court documents." Julian gasped. His eyes widened in pure terror. The specific mention of the divorce documents hit him like a freight train. He realized this wasn't just about Rupert's bad property deals. It was about the paperwork he had forged to steal my house. The officer wrenched Julian's arms behind his back. The cuffs tightened with a sharp click. "You have the right to legal representation. If you cannot afford a solicitor, a duty solicitor will be provided for you." Julian twisted his head, ignoring the officer reading him his rights. Blood, wine, and tears mixed on his face as he looked up at the grand staircase. This time, he didn't look at Arabella. He didn't look at Alistair. He looked directly at me, the woman he had legally discarded, manipulated, and tried to leave homeless. "Eleanor, please!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with absolute desperation as the NCA officers began to drag him towards the exit. "Eleanor, you have to help me. Use the inheritance. Use Beatrix's money to pay for my legal fees. Please. I'm your husband. You have to save me." I didn't blink as Julian begged for my help. I watched the officers lift my ex-husband up. The cold steel of the handcuffs glinted beneath the chandeliers. Julian pleaded, his voice breaking with a pathetic desperation that echoed through the silent crowd of billionaires. He begged me to use the £28 million he tried to steal to secure his freedom. I offered him absolutely nothing. I gave him a slow, dismissive wave of my hand as the officers dragged him towards the mahogany doors. Right behind him, another pair of officers marched Rupert towards the exit. Rupert looked completely dead inside. His designer linen suit was torn and stained with blood and red wine. As the officers led him past the grand staircase, Rupert didn't look at his wealthy investors. He looked directly at his wife. Sophie was frozen near the shattered ice sculpture. Her entire curated reality was collapsing in real time. For years, she built a massive social media following projecting an image of flawless luxury. She sold the illusion of a wealthy, progressive white husband and limitless capital. Now that same husband was being paraded out in handcuffs, facing years in a high-security prison for corporate fraud. I watched Sophie closely. I expected her to cry for the man she married. But Sophie didn't shed a single tear for her husband. As the heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off her connection to Rupert forever, Sophie only cared about one thing, her brand. Sophie turned her frantic gaze towards me. The arrogant influencer who had cornered me in our mother's kitchen days ago was completely gone. She stumbled forward, her expensive heels slipping on the spilled champagne covering the marble floor. She abandoned every ounce of her pride, shoving past the staring elite guests to reach the landing of the staircase where I stood. "Eleanor," Sophie gasped, her breath catching in hyperventilating sobs. "Eleanor, please, wait. You have to listen to me." I looked down at my younger sister. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined. Dark streaks of mascara ran down her cheeks, staining the collar of her silk evening gown. She looked frantic, stripped of the golden child armor our mother had wrapped her in since birth. "You can't let them do this," Sophie begged, gripping the brass handrail of the staircase. "You have to help me fix this. My phone is already blowing up. The blogs are posting the arrest records. My sponsors are going to drop me in the morning. I have a lifestyle brand to maintain. If the public finds out Rupert was running a fraudulent shell company to fund our lives, I will lose everything. I will be cancelled. I stared at her, marveling at the absolute depth of her narcissism. Your husband is currently sitting in the back of a police van, facing serious prison time for money laundering and identity theft, I said, my voice projecting an icy detachment. And your primary concern is your social media engagement metrics. Sophie gripped the brass handrail tighter. Her knuckles turned white. You don't understand how this industry works, Eleanor. I have morality clauses in my brand deals. If they find out the luxury penthouse was repossessed, they will demand their upfront payments back. The leasing company is already threatening to repossess my G-Wagon because Rupert missed the last 3 payments. I can't be seen driving a normal car. I can't go back to being ordinary. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperate, calculating greed. You have £28 million. You just showed the bank statements to the whole room. You can easily give me a bridging loan. Just a couple of million to pay off Rupert's immediate business debts, clear the car lease, and secure a new luxury flat so I can keep producing content. We are sisters, Eleanor. We have to protect our Black British excellence. We have to stick together. The sheer audacity of her request hung suspended in the air. She actively conspired with Julian to steal my house. She literally told me to take one for the team and walk away quietly so her fraudster husband could avoid prison. Now she was begging for the very inheritance she had tried to help Julian steal. I slowly descended the final 2 marble steps, stepping right into her personal space. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute lethal authority in my tone made Sophie physically recoil. We do not have a sisterhood, Sophie, I whispered, my words slicing through her frantic delusions. A sister does not corner her own blood in a kitchen and demand she sign over her property to a parasite. You knew Julian forged those divorce papers. You knew Rupert was a criminal. You built your entire fake kingdom on the destruction of my life, and you loved every second of it. Eleanor, please. I was just trying to survive, Sophie sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out to touch my emerald green gown. I took a clean step back, avoiding her grasp. You love the aesthetic of wealth, I said, my eyes locking onto hers with pure, unrelenting ice. You love the cameras, the designer bags, and the unearned arrogance. You wanted his lifestyle so badly, Sophie. Now you get to keep his debts. Sophie let out a broken, agonizing wail. She fell to her knees on the marble floor, right in the middle of the billionaire's ballroom, openly weeping as the elite guests watched with quiet disgust. She begged me for a loan, a car, anything to save her from the ordinary life she feared. I turned my back on her completely. I caught the eye of the lead private security contractor I hired for the evening. I gave a single, definitive nod, gesturing towards my weeping sister. The guard moved immediately. He and another security operative stepped forward, grabbing Sophie firmly by the arms. They hoisted the golden child off the floor and began physically escorting her towards the heavy mahogany exit doors. Sophie screamed my name, thrashing against the guards, kicking her designer heels as she was publicly dragged out of the high society event she had always believed she belonged in. I didn't watch her leave. I simply adjusted the vintage diamond necklace resting against my collarbone and gracefully walked out through the private side exit Alistair had arranged for me. The cool night air brushed against my skin as I stepped onto the secluded cobblestone driveway. My chauffeured car was already idling by the curb, the engine purring quietly. I felt a profound peace. I slid into the plush leather back seat of the car. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary of absolute financial freedom. I reached into my velvet clutch to check my messages. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the vehicle. I had a new voicemail. It was from my mother, Margaret. I stared at the notification, fully aware that Margaret had fled the ballroom the moment I exposed her church embezzlement to her own congregation. The panic radiating from this blinking voicemail icon promised an entirely new level of desperation. I tapped the screen, held the phone to my ear, and listened as the final pillars of her fake empire crumbled. The voicemail that played through my phone speaker was a symphony of despair. My mother, Margaret, was hyperventilating. Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush. Eleanor, you have to answer the phone. Churchwarden Miller has locked the doors to the sanctuary. Half the congregation saw the news about Julian's arrest online, and the parish council held an emergency vote. They are going to call the police on me, Eleanor. You have to fix this. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please. I deleted the voicemail with a single tap. I didn't call her back. Let her sit in the ashes of the empire she valued more than her own daughter. I told my driver to take me home, where I slept for 8 solid hours. The next morning was a crisp, clear Sunday. Normally, at this hour, my mother would be holding court in the foyer of St. Jude's Parish, adjusting her extravagant lavender fascinator and accepting compliments on her flawless family. Today, the reality was starkly different. I parked my car across the street from the massive brick building of the church. The heavy oak front doors were pulled tightly shut. A thick, heavy-duty chain was wrapped securely around the brass handles, locked with a heavy padlock. Standing on the concrete steps, looking completely unrecognizable, was Margaret. She wasn't wearing a bespoke suit. She wore a crumpled grey trench coat over plain clothes, her hair devoid of its usual immaculate styling. She was furiously shaking the locked handles of the church doors, demanding to be let in. I walked across the empty car park, the rhythmic click of my heels echoing in the quiet Sunday air. Margaret heard my approach and spun around sharply. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale and drawn. "Eleanor," she gasped, running down the concrete steps towards me. "You came. I knew you would come. You have to ring Churchwarden Miller. You have to explain to him that Julian acted alone, that I had no idea the roof fund money was going to that wedding venue. If you tell them I'm innocent, they will listen to you. You're a forensic auditor. They'll believe your report." I stopped a few feet away from her. "I am a forensic auditor," I replied calmly, "which is exactly why I will not lie to cover up a paper trail that proves your direct complicity. You signed the authorization checks, Mother. You handed the congregation's money over to a fraudster because you wanted to show off your wealthy son-in-law at the country club. How can you be so cold?" she cried, her voice bouncing off the brick walls of the empty church. "I gave you life. I raised you. You sent your brother-in-law to a federal-level prison. You had Julian arrested. You evicted your own sister, and now you are ruining my life. You have destroyed our entire family." I looked at the woman who had spent 34 years treating me like a defective accessory in her grand social performance. I felt absolutely no anger, only a deep, chilling clarity. "I didn't destroy this family," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "You destroyed it the day you decided appearances mattered more than your daughter's safety." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't let her speak. "When Julian started showing red flags, when I told you 3 years ago that money was mysteriously vanishing from my accounts, you told me to shut my mouth." I reminded her, dragging her ugly history into the harsh light of day. "You told me a good black woman protects her husband's image at all costs. You knew he was toxic, but you silenced me because having a married daughter in a big house looked good for your profile on the church committee. You enabled a parasite. You fed him with my money and happily watched him bleed me dry just so you could maintain your fake aesthetic." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was just trying to keep you together. Marriage is hard, Eleanor." "Marriage is a partnership," I corrected her. "What Julian and I had was a hostage situation, and you handed him the ropes." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. I held it out to her. "What is this?" Margaret whispered, staring at the envelope as if it contained a live explosive. "It's your only way out," I explained flatly. "Inside is a first-class, one-way plane ticket to a very small, very quiet village in the Shetland Islands. I have already secured a modest one-bedroom flat there in your name, paid in full for the next 2 years. There is also a legal contract. I am offering you a monthly allowance of £2,000. It is enough to buy groceries and keep the lights on." Margaret stared at the envelope, her face contorted in pure horror. "Shetland? £2,000? Eleanor, I cannot live on that. I have a certain lifestyle. My friends are here. My reputation is here." "Your reputation is currently locked behind those chained doors," I stated, gesturing towards the church. "And your friends are actively cooperating with the fraud investigation. You do not have a lifestyle left. The allowance comes with an ironclad non-disclosure and no contact agreement." I continued, "You will never ring me again. You will never email me, text me, or attempt to visit me. The moment you violate this agreement, the funding stops permanently, and I will personally hand-deliver the uncensored audit of your embezzlement directly to HM, Revenue and Customs." Margaret let out a broken wail. She fell to her knees on the cold concrete steps. "I won't do it," she spat, her voice shaking with stubborn pride. "I will not sign a contract giving up my own daughter. I am a respected woman. I will clear my name." "All right," I said. I simply dropped the envelope. "Good luck, Margaret." I left the envelope on the cold concrete steps of the locked church and walked back towards my waiting car. The crisp morning air felt incredibly clean. Before my chauffeur could open the door for me, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID displayed an automated alert from a Category B remand prison. An inmate was requesting a reverse charge call. I accepted the charges, stepping into the plush leather back seat of my vehicle. Eleanor, please, don't hang up, Julian gasped through the crackling audio connection. His voice sounded raw, frantic, completely stripped of the smooth, arrogant cadence he used to weaponize to control every room he walked into. You have to come see me. They have me on remand. No bail until the plea hearing. You're the only person who answers my calls. I listened to his ragged breathing echoing over the line. I felt not an ounce of pity for the man who had secretly divorced me to steal my house and my dignity. But I did feel a distinct craving for closure. I wanted to see exactly how the realization of his total destruction settled into his eyes. I'll be there in an hour, I replied, my voice perfectly level. I ended the call before he could utter another word. HMP Wandsworth was a towering, sterile fortress of Victorian brick and reinforced steel, a stark contrast to the billionaire's ballroom where Julian had last been seen. I walked through the security checkpoints wearing a sleek, bespoke burgundy suit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the dull lino floors. I sat in the visitor's booth, looking through the thick, smudge-covered perspex glass. A heavy metal door clanged open on the other side. A guard escorted Julian into the room. The sight of him was almost jarring. The bespoke Savile Row suits, the expensive watches, and the meticulously curated facade of black British excellence were completely gone. He wore an ill-fitting, standard-issue grey prison tracksuit. His shoulders were slumped, his face bruised and swollen from the brutal fight with Rupert the night before. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered, defeated scammer. Julian practically fell into the plastic chair opposite me, snatching up the heavy black receiver. I picked up my end of the phone, watching his desperate eyes scan my face for any sign of the obedient, easily manipulated wife he thought he knew. Eleanor, thank God you came, Julian breathed, his voice shaking with manufactured emotion. He pressed his free hand against the glass, adopting the deeply sincere, manipulative persona he had perfected over the years. I know how angry you are, and I don't blame you. But you have to listen to me. Everything I did, the paperwork, the divorce, I did it to protect you. I raised a single eyebrow, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat, to protect me. Yes, Julian insisted, leaning closer to the glass with pleading eyes. Rupert was drowning in corporate debt. He was dragging me down with him. I saw the disaster coming, Eleanor. I knew the SFO investigators were coming. I forged that decree absolute because I needed to separate our assets. I needed to ensure your credit, your career, and your future were completely shielded from the fallout. The wedding with Arabella, that was just a business transaction. I was going to use her father's money to clear the debt, and then I was going to come back to you. I did it all for us. I stared at the man sitting on the other side of the glass. The absolute audacity required to pitch a secret divorce and an engagement to a billionaire heiress as an act of protective marital sacrifice was staggering. He was still trying to play me for a fool, still assuming I was the naive, boring accountant who would swallow his lies just to keep a man in her house. You need to help me, Eleanor, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking as he delivered his final demand. The magistrate set my surety at £5 million because they consider me a flight risk. You have $28 million in that trust fund. You can transfer the money right now. You can get me out of here. We can hire the best defense barristers in London. We can fix this. I love you, Eleanor. I always have. Please, save me. I didn't argue with his ridiculous narrative. I didn't scream or demand an apology for his betrayal. Instead, I reached into the sleek leather folder I had brought with me. I pulled out a single, glossy, high-resolution photograph. I slowly slid the image flat against the thick perspex directly into his line of sight. Julian stopped talking, his eyes locked onto the photograph. It was a close-up shot of my left hand resting on the steering wheel of my luxury car. Sitting prominently on my middle finger was a stunning, flawless diamond ring. It was the exact same £7,500 engagement ring from Boodles that Julian had purchased for Arabella. Using my personal credit card, I tracked the jeweler's receipt through my forensic audit. I explained, my voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel. Because you used my current account to secure the purchase, the asset legally belonged to me. I simply provided the receipt and the police report regarding your credit card fraud to the authorities, and they confiscated the ring from Arabella last night as stolen property. They returned it to its rightful owner this morning. Julian stared at the photograph, his mouth hanging open in pure disbelief. The lie he had just spun about protecting me crumbled to dust right before his eyes. I kept the ring, Julian, I said, offering him a sharp smile that contained absolutely no warmth. It fits incredibly well on my middle finger. The realization that his manipulation tactics were completely useless finally hit him. He slammed his fist against the perspex, his face contorted with impotent rage. You can't leave me in here, he screamed, abandoning the loving husband act entirely. "I won't survive in a Category B prison. You have to get me out." I stood up, smoothing down the front of my burgundy jacket. "I am not getting you out, Julian, and even if I wanted to, you have a much bigger problem than making bail." Julian froze, his fist still pressed against the glass. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the man who thought he could destroy my life for a payout. When the NCA officers took Rupert away last night, he lasted exactly 4 hours in the interview room before his white privilege complex shattered completely. He couldn't stomach the reality of a prison sentence, so he took a plea deal at dawn. Julian stopped breathing. His face turned a sickly greyish hue. "Rupert handed over his entire digital archive," I continued, delivering the final, fatal blow. "Every text message, every forged document, every wire transfer request you sent him, he gave them everything in exchange for a reduced sentence at an open prison. Rupert has officially agreed to act as the Crown's star witness against you. They are going to pin the entire conspiracy directly on you. You are going to serve his time, Julian." I placed the phone receiver back onto the metal hook, cutting off his frantic, panic-stricken screams. I turned my back on the glass booth and walked confidently out of the remand center, leaving him completely trapped in the nightmare he had built himself. 3 floors down, in a similar government building, Rupert was shaking in a windowless interview room. The harsh fluorescent lights washed out his expensive linen suit, which was now torn, stained with red wine, and smelled of stale sweat. He rubbed his bruised wrists where the steel handcuffs had dug into his skin just hours earlier. Sitting across from him at the cold aluminium table were 2 investigators, Officer Miller and Officer Hayes. They stared at him with blank, unreadable expressions. Rupert leaned back in his metal chair, desperately trying to summon the country club arrogance that had protected him his entire life. He flashed a weak, charming smile to gloss over his empty bank accounts. "Listen, gents," Rupert said smoothly. "I know exactly how this looks, but I am a victim here. Julian manipulated my entire family. He came to me with massive property proposals, and I trusted him because he was married to my sister-in-law. I just provided the seed capital. I had no idea he was moving funds from illegal accounts or forging property deeds. I'm a legitimate businessman caught in the crossfire of his messy divorce." Officer Miller rested his forearms on the table. "A legitimate businessman?" "Absolutely," Rupert insisted, his confidence growing. "My family has deep roots in this city. My father plays golf with a high court judge. I'm sure if I make a few calls, my father can have his legal team down here to clear up this massive misunderstanding. There's no need to ruin my reputation over a black man making financial mistakes. You know how these blokes operate, always trying to cut corners. I was just too trusting and tried to help a minority entrepreneur." Rupert leaned forward, expecting a nod of complicity from the 2 white officers sitting across from him. He expected the invisible shield of his race and his perceived wealth to deflect the federal charges directly onto Julian. Officer Hayes didn't nod or smile. He simply reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a digital audio recorder, and placed it perfectly in the center of the aluminium table. "You have a very interesting definition of being a victim, Rupert," Officer Hayes said, entirely devoid of sympathy. "We received a highly detailed forensic package this morning from a limited company. It included bank statements, sort codes, and several extremely clear audio files. Let's have a listen together." Officer Hayes pressed play. The sterile interview room suddenly filled with the unmistakable sound of Rupert's own voice. It was the recording from my mother's kitchen, captured perfectly by my smartwatch. Rupert's voice bounced off the concrete walls, arrogant and vicious. "You are going to sign that TR1 property transfer by Friday," the recorded Rupert snarled. "If you try to ruin this deal with Arabella's family, I will personally ruin your pathetic career. I know powerful people at your auditing firm." The recording transitioned seamlessly into the second audio file. It was the confrontation in the car park. The acoustics were flawless. "If investigators raid my shell companies tomorrow morning, I am not going down alone," Rupert's voice boomed from the speaker. "I have the paper trail proving you authorized those fake invoices to siphon money from the church building fund. I will hand that evidence directly to the NCA and tell them you masterminded the wire fraud operation." Officer Hayes hit the pause button. The silence in the interview room was deafening. Rupert stared at the digital recorder. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. His mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The charming, misunderstood businessman routine evaporated entirely. He was listening to himself confess to wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering, along with confirmation of his racist text messages. "That is taken out of context," Rupert stammered, a thin layer of panic finally cracking his voice. "You can't use that. It was a private conversation." My father's barristers will have that thrown out of court immediately. You blokes don't understand who you are dealing with. My family has resources. We will bury this department in litigation." Officer Miller sighed, pulling a thick manila folder from his briefcase and sliding a single sheet of paper across the metal table. "Your family does not have any resources anymore, Rupert," Officer Miller stated coldly. "We reviewed the financial disclosures provided by your primary creditor. Your father heavily leveraged the family estate and all corporate holdings through high-risk, predatory bridging loans to keep your failing projects afloat." Rupert frowned, looking down at the document. It was an absolute repossession and asset seizure notice. As of yesterday morning, Officer Miller continued, every single one of those predatory loans was legally purchased by a new holding company, the exact same one that provided us with these audio recordings. The chief executive of that company exercised her right to collect on your defaulted debt. She repossessed your penthouse, she repossessed your shell companies, and this morning, she repossessed your father's estate. Your family is completely bankrupt. You do not have a golf buddy on the bench anymore, and you certainly cannot afford a legal team. You have absolutely nothing. Rupert stared at the repossession document. He saw the name of the holding company printed clearly at the top of the page, with my name listed as the sole proprietor. The woman he had ridiculed as a boring accountant. The woman he had racially profiled and threatened to destroy now owned everything his family had built over 3 generations. She hadn't just beaten him. She had eradicated his entire bloodline's wealth. His father couldn't save him. His white privilege couldn't protect him from the cold, hard numbers of a federal audit. He was going to prison as a broke, exposed fraudster. The realization hit Rupert like a physical blow. His arrogant posture collapsed completely. His shoulders hunched inward as he hugged his stomach as if he had been gutted. A pathetic whimper escaped his throat. Rupert dropped his heavy head onto the cold aluminium table. The sophisticated property mogul, stripped of his unearned confidence, began to cry. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical sob. He gasped for air, his tears forming a puddle on the repossession document bearing my name. He was completely and utterly ruined, facing a dark future locked in a small cell. 6 months later, the air inside the grand atrium of the newly built Beatrix Foundation crackled with a genuine electric energy. I stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down at hundreds of young black women navigating state-of-the-art tech labs and financial literacy classrooms. This wasn't the fake, performative excellence my mother used to parade around her church. This was real power. I used a fraction of Aunt Beatrix's £28 million inheritance to build this centre from the ground up, giving women who looked like me the exact tools they needed to protect their assets. To learn forensic accounting and build generational wealth that no parasitic man could ever touch. I wore a bespoke ivory trouser suit, a stark contrast to the dark conservative clothing my family always demanded I hide myself in. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the ambient noise of collaboration and success wash over me. The contrast between my current reality and the miserable fates of the people who tried to destroy me was nothing short of poetic. Right at this very second, Julian was sitting in a high-security Category B prison. The man who obsessed over bespoke suits and luxury watches now wore a mass-produced grey tracksuit. His conversational charm was completely useless behind reinforced steel doors. He had tried to outsmart a forensic auditor, and his reward was a mandatory 10-year sentence for identity theft, fraud, and the forgery of legal court documents. There were no country club connections to save him. He was just another inmate locked in a concrete box, spending 2-3 hours a day staring at a blank wall, realizing he threw away a lavish life for absolutely nothing. Rupert wasn't faring much better. Despite his desperate attempts to leverage his white privilege and shift the blame onto Julian, the judge showed him not an ounce of leniency. He was currently serving a 5-year sentence in a Category D open prison. The arrogant property developer who used to mock my career now worked his assigned shift in the prison laundry, spending 8 hours a day folding damp institutional bedsheets. His family name was completely disgraced, and his fake corporate empire was erased from existence. And then there was my sister, Sophie. Her glamorous influencer lifestyle evaporated the moment I repossessed the penthouse and froze the credit cards. Without Rupert's fraudulent funds to sustain her aesthetic, her 50,000 followers quickly realized her entire life was a carefully orchestrated lie. Her account was mass-reported and permanently deleted. Today, our family's former golden child worked a minimum-wage job in retail on Oxford Street. She spent her weekends folding jumpers on sale, dealing with rude customers, and taking the night bus back to a cramped rented room she could barely afford. The designer bags she used to flaunt were liquidated months ago to pay her mounting legal fees. My mother, Margaret, received the exact fate she earned. She rejected the plane ticket to Shetland out of pure stubborn pride. She thought her high society church friends would rally around her once the initial shock wore off. She was completely wrong. When the full extent of her complicity in Julian's embezzlement went public, the parish council formally excommunicated her. The women she used to gossip with crossed the street when they saw her coming. Margaret was forced to move into a small, dated flat on the outskirts of London. She had no congregation to control, no wealthy son-in-law to boast about, and no daughter willing to tolerate her toxic manipulation. She was completely shunned, living out her days in total isolation, surrounded only by the ghosts of her shattered reputation. A soft clinking sound pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Arabella stepping onto the balcony, holding 2 crystal flutes of expensive champagne. She wore a stunning emerald green dress, glowing and completely unbothered by the dramatic implosion of her previous engagement. She walked over to me with a bright smile. "I thought you might need a proper drink to celebrate this opening," Arabella said, handing me a flute with a warm, genuine smile. "The facilities look absolutely incredible, Eleanor. You really outdid yourself." I accepted the glass, gently clinking it against hers. "I had excellent inspiration," I replied, "and I have an excellent new business partner." Arabella and I had taken the bizarre, traumatic connection of being manipulated by the same man and transformed it into a highly lucrative corporate alliance. Arabella brought her father's massive Silicon Valley tech resources, and I brought my ruthless financial auditing expertise. We recently launched a joint venture capital firm in Mayfair that specialized in vetting aggressive startups, specifically weeding out fraudulent developers who operated exactly like Rupert. We were making millions together, turning a shared betrayal into an unstoppable financial empire. "We caught a very big rat," Arabella laughed, taking a sip of her champagne, "and built a very big mousetrap in the process. It was the perfect outcome for both of us." Before I could agree, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my ivory blazer. I pulled it out, expecting a message from the catering team downstairs. Instead, I saw a high-priority alert from the private demolition contractor I had hired earlier this week. I opened the message. It contained a short, high-definition video clip. I tapped to play, watching as a massive yellow JCB slammed its heavy steel bucket directly into the front porch of my old semi-detached house. The house Julian had secretly divorced me to steal. The house he planned to use as leverage to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle. The wooden frame splintered, the roof collapsed inward in a cloud of thick grey dust, and the entire structure was demolished into rubble in seconds. I stared at the screen. A slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. We were ready. The video ended, leaving nothing but a cloud of grey dust and cleared earth where my past used to stand. The rubble was a fitting metaphor for the toxic relationships I had finally eradicated from my life. I locked my phone screen and slipped the device back into the pocket of my ivory blazer. The foundation opening downstairs was a massive success, a beautiful symphony of networking, education, and empowerment. But as evening fell over the city, I needed a brief moment of quiet solitude. I left the bustling charity gala on the lower levels and took the private glass lift up to the top floor of the newly built building, my new personal penthouse. I pushed open the heavy glass sliding doors and stepped out onto the expansive wraparound balcony. The crisp night air brushed against my skin, carrying the distant rhythmic hum of urban life. I stood at the edge of the reinforced glass railing, looking out over the glittering, endless London skyline that I now practically owned. I felt absolutely no bitterness in my heart. I felt no lingering anger towards the people who tried to destroy me. I was at total and absolute peace with every single decision I had made over the last 6 months. I turned my head slightly, catching my own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. I took a long, slow look at myself. For 34 years, my mother, Margaret, had conditioned me to believe I was small. She told me I was too rigid, too boring, and incapable of maintaining the image of black British excellence she so desperately craved for her church friends. Julian had convinced me I was nothing more than a reliable paycheck, a dry accountant who lacked the vision to build a true legacy. Sophie had belittled my bespoke suits, calling me toxic and bitter simply because I refused to fund her fraudulent, social media-driven aesthetic. Rupert had tried to use his white privilege to intimidate me into silence. All of them had completely miscalculated my worth. They assumed my silence meant submission, failing to realize it was simply the quiet calculation of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The boring accountant was completely gone. She died the moment Mr. Sterling handed me that forged paperwork in the bank manager's office 8 months ago. In her place stood a titan. The woman in the reflection wore power like a second skin. Her posture was flawless, her gaze sharp, calculating, and unyielding. I had taken the worst betrayal a family could inflict and weaponized it, transforming a hostile takeover into a multi-sin's million-pound empire. I didn't just survive their coordinated attack. I devoured them entirely, dismantled their lies, and bought the very ground they used to stand on. I walked back inside the penthouse, moving across the plush, hand-woven rugs towards my private study. The walls were lined with massive mahogany bookshelves and striking modern art, but the centerpiece of the room lay flat on my polished desk. I walked over and picked up the pristine document. It was the original county-stamped decree absolute, the exact piece of paper Julian had paid a dirty solicitor to forge behind my back to steal my assets. Most people would have burned it. Most women would have shredded the painful reminder of a broken marriage and a husband's ultimate betrayal, lighting a match and watching the ashes scatter in the wind. I had a completely different plan. I picked up a heavy, custom-made mahogany frame resting beside the document. I carefully placed the decree absolute behind the glass, ensuring the forged signature and the finalization date were perfectly centered and visible. I secured the velvet backing and held the frame up to the ambient light. This piece of paper wasn't a symbol of my victimization. It was the greatest gift Julian ever gave me. It was the exact instrument of his financial execution and the very tool of my absolute liberation. I walked over to the prominent empty space on the wall directly behind my desk and hung the frame. It sat right beside my advanced degrees and my corporate auditing certifications. It was a beautiful daily reminder that letting your enemies underestimate your intelligence is the most profitable strategy in the world. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. The screen lit up with a dozen new notifications: elite investors wanting to schedule meetings, young black women thanking me for the Beatrix Foundation grants, Arabella texting me about a massive new corporate acquisition we were planning for the next quarter. There were no frantic calls from Margaret begging for a handout after her excommunication from the church. There were no manipulative texts from Sophie demanding I restore her ruined reputation or buy back her repossessed car. There were no fake apologies from Julian begging for bail money from a prison cell. The absolute silence from my former family was the most expensive, luxurious sound I had ever heard in my life. I smiled a deep, genuine expression of pure, unfiltered satisfaction. I held down the power button on my phone, swiping the screen to power the device down completely. The corporate world and its endless demands could wait until tomorrow morning. I smoothed the lapels of my bespoke ivory suit. I took one last look at the framed decree absolute on the wall and turned around. I walked out of the study and headed back towards the private lift. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the main floor. The brass doors opened to the vibrant sound of laughter, clinking champagne flutes, and brilliant minds discussing real, tangible futures. I walked back into the party, surrounded by people who respected my mind, my power, and my undeniable excellence. The revenge was officially complete. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your true worth is never determined by the toxic family members who constantly underestimate you. Blood does not excuse abuse or emotional manipulation. True liberation comes when you stop seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. By building your own financial independence and establishing unbreakable boundaries, you finally reclaim your stolen power. The ultimate revenge is never blind rage, but unbothered success and profound self-respect. You must courageously choose yourself whenever others utterly refuse to do so.